Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Stevens. I'll be your moderator for this evening. Our talk this evening is going to be Heal the Past, Embrace the Present, Plan for the Future. And our speaker this evening is Cal Domingue. Cal Domingue, LMFT, was born in Louisiana and raised in the Cajun tradition and heritage. And in the Cajun tradition, he completed a BS in mathematics and a Bachelor of Musical Performance in voice performance at what is now the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. After living in Houston for 5 years, he moved to San Francisco, where he has resided since 1980. After being in the work for some time, Cal returned to school and completed an MA in Social Clinical Psychology at the New College of California, magna cum laude. Cal works currently as a private practice psychotherapist, specializing in working with gifted children and adults. He is also employed as a principal support engineer for Computer Associates Technologies, an international software firm. Cal has won numerous awards and recognitions in the software community, including being elected to a user group Hall of Fame and being named Best in World by Computer Associates. In the therapy world, he has served as a supervisor of psychology interns for the California Pacific Medical Center and as a president and webmaster for Gelesta, a LGBT Therapist Association. He has presented on numerous topics at software conferences and in the therapy world. These include presentations on various aspects of giftedness at the 2013 SENG conference in Orlando, as well as to gifted schools and programs. He is a trained SANG model parent group facilitator. Cal has also sung professionally, is a licensed shiatsu masseuse, and a licensed non-denominational minister. As you might guess, Cal identifies with the multi-potential aspects of giftedness. He is a member of Mensa and a 999 Society, and currently resides in San Francisco with his partner of 25 years and their 2 cats. So, without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce Cal Domingue. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate it. And welcome everyone to our SENGinar. There may be folks joining us, other folks joining us along the way. So before we launch into the meat of our presentation, I'd like to just get a sense of who I have on the phone. I know that you guys can't speak. Or we can't hear you if you're talking to your computer is more accurate. But I have a few polling questions that I'd like to get the sense of who's here. So you should now see the first of those on there. If you are a parent perfect and you are voting, you guys are great at jumping right in. So thank you for doing that. So it seems like pretty much everybody on the line so far is the parent of a gifted child. So maybe that's the perspective we're coming from. I'm also curious to know if we have any teachers on the phone, on the call. So if any of you are teachers of gifted children, go ahead and indicate that if you would. And for each of these questions, I'll try to leave them open for just a couple seconds to see who, we have, to give folks a chance to respond. Thanks very much. And yeah, you can see that you just choose the answer that's appropriate for you. So I'm wondering how many of you, if I were to ask the question, are you gifted, would answer yes or no to that? And I see one of you is asking the question, what if we don't know? That's a great question. You're allowed to not vote. That's certainly true. But that will be part of what we address during the presentation today. So there's a couple of concepts that I'll be talking about today, and just to give me a sense of your background in order to know how much detail to go into about these concepts. The first one is Dabrowski's theory of overexcitabilities. So if you guys could give me a sense of if you've heard of this before or not, how familiar you are with it, that would be very helpful for me. Great. So it seems like you've definitely all heard of it, and we have some varying levels of familiarity with that. Thanks very much. Okay, great. See, the polls are still coming in. Great. Thank you very much. And last question is a similar type question, just wondering how familiar you are with the concept of asynchronous development in gifted individuals. These are two of the concepts I'll be talking about today. And if you have heard of these, which it seems like uh, many of you or most of you have, don't worry, I'm not going to get bogged down in them, and that's not the bulk of the presentation, but it is part of the background I'll be presenting at the beginning. So this is just giving me an idea of how quickly to go through that or in how much detail. Great. Okay, perfect. Thanks very much. That's extremely helpful. So that wraps up our polls for today. Thank you for participating. So just to give you, so Stephen did a great intro. Thank you so much for that. This is what I look like. We don't have an interactive webcam. The picture is a couple of years old, but that's basically what I still look like. And this is my contact information. I have a private practice here in San Francisco. And I am available for folks over the phone or by email if folks have questions or comments or if there's anything in the presentation that they want to follow up on. One thing that so my understanding is that after the presentation, all of you who have attended, and including those who have signed up but are not attending live, will receive a link that will take you to a recording of the webcast, the SENGinar, and you will also receive a attachment, which will be a PDF containing the slides of this PowerPoint presentation. The only reason that's relevant is that it is somewhat text dense, and it's certainly, oh, thank you for the moderator for reiterating that. The presentation is somewhat text dense. I will be moving through it somewhat rapidly. So if there's something that catches your interest that I don't spend as much time on as you would like, you will be able to get a copy of it, and you can certainly follow up with me after. I've tried to footnote the presentation as extensively as I can. So if there's a particular page, the topic that catches your interest, you can notice the footnotes there and go to the footnote listings at the end of the presentation, and that may give you some articles for further reference. So I hope that's helpful for you. So what's our agenda today in the 90 minutes we have? First, I'll just talk a little bit about intro, what my perspective is, and the point of view I'm coming from. Talk a little bit about psychology and its relevance to giftedness. And then we'll get into the three sort of target areas that were in the title: the past, what is there to heal; the present, regardless of where that may be in your life or in the life of your child or student; and the future, where to go from here, again, regardless of where you might be. And then we'll have summary. My goal, as I mentioned in the text, which I hope you could all see, is that if you do have questions or comments along the way, please feel free to enter them in the chat box. As long as we have time, I'll try to address them. And if we get bogged down, I may ask you to hold those until the end. And there will be time for questions at the end as well. So, where am I coming from? Well, I'm going to present a few ideas today, a few theories about giftedness, about psychology. My approach to this work is very much what some people have called Zen mind, beginner's mind. So while I certainly have a certain level of expertise and familiarity with the literature, my fundamental belief is that each of you is the expert in your own life, and what I can do is offer various research, various thoughts and perspectives I might have, so that you can consider those in the spirit of take what you like and leave the rest. This may give you kind of fodder for thought to ponder on. It will address the lifespan to some extent, because who we are as adults and who our children become as adults definitely is impacted to some degree by what we experience as children. So hopefully this will just be part of the ongoing dialogue that you may have about the impact of giftedness in your life and your family's life and in your schoolrooms. What I will not be doing today is trying to tell you who you are or who you should be or what you should do about your life. Should is one of those words that I don't believe in very strongly. So, without further ado, let's just plunge in a bit to psychology, which is the background from which I approach this. So psychology is kind of the intersection of many things. Biology is the structure and anatomy of the body, but in this case, the brain, in terms of what's impacting us. Physiology might be thought of as how it works, what happens when, what triggers which responses, etc. Psychology is to some extent the intersection of behavior and information, but it certainly incorporates aspects of biology and physiology. And the more research that is done, the more we see that neurophysiology plays an important part in psychology. Psychology is often called different things: coaching, counseling, therapy, psychoanalysis. Historically, in terms of other sciences and in terms of the human race, it's a very young science. So in my experience, it's very helpful when it's integrated with ancient wisdom methods as well. It's basically an exploration of consciousness, as Plato described it, later quoted by Madonna. The unexamined life is not worth living. So that's kind of where psychology, I think, can come in helpful, is to help us become more self-aware or simply foster a questioning aspect about who we are, how we came to be, where we're going. From the perspective of psychology, giftedness has multiple different definitions. So if you ask different people, well, what does gifted mean? You'll get potentially several different answers. The answer will generally focus on level of intelligence, although sometimes it also brings into question certain talents, or being talented in specific areas. So being perhaps a musical prodigy or a prodigy at languages is often considered to be, a person is often considered to be gifted, even if they don't match specific IQ criteria. Various professionals will measure this differently, so this is where some of the variation comes in. Some of those ways that that's measured are listed here. Gifted children sometimes are measured by how they perform in school in terms of grade level work, that sort of thing. If you are the parent, and this is what I was alluding to earlier in the poll questions when I asked how many of you thought of yourselves as gifted adults, most often parents of gifted children are gifted themselves. However, this is a relatively new field. And a relatively new area that's getting attention. So a lot of gifted adults don't consider themselves to be such. It's also not unusual for an adult to say, oh, well, I used to be gifted, meaning that when they were in school, they were identified as such. Perhaps they were enrolled in a GATE program, or a gifted and talented education program, or perhaps they scored very highly on tests, or perhaps they had a prodigious talent like music or something like that. But often once people pass out of the school system, those sort of recognitions for one's giftedness become less and less frequent. And so sometimes people do not identify with it as much as adults. However, in my experience, giftedness is a lifelong journey, and it's definitely a part of our identity. In addition to the level of intelligence, gifted is actually much more than simply being smart. So there's a bunch of different aspects of it here, different characteristics that are often associated with being smart. And as you may notice, as you look at this, we may hit a problem later on, but anyway, as you notice this, as you look at the slide, you'll see that many of these actually do not have to do with level of intelligence, or they are certainly not things that would show up on intelligence tests, such as being morally sensitive, showing compassion, having a vivid imagination, being highly creative, being sensitive, or feelings that are hurt easily. However, they are definitely part and parcel of being gifted. Dabrowski's theory, which you're all somewhat familiar with at least, talks about this or addresses some of this. The way that I tend to think about Dabrowski's theory of overexcitabilities is that people who are designated as gifted do so because their brain functions in a certain way. It functions in a way that is notably different than what we might call the norm. So it's outside the quote-unquote norm in terms of a bell curve in some way. Well, the brain is part of our nervous system. So if the brain functions physiologically differently, why would the rest of our nervous system be expected to function any differently than our brain does? Why would it be expected to function any more within quote unquote normal range? That's the way that I tend to hold the idea of overexcitabilities, is that our entire nervous systems may be exceptional in some ways. They do, I think, indicate very fundamental attributes as to who we are, how we work, how we interact with the world. And they're directly correlated to the physiological sensitivity of the nervous system. The OEs tend to have five manifestations. I've listed them here in no particular order: psychomotor, intellectual, emotional, sensual, imaginational. And I'll talk about those, each one, in just a minute. Um, they basically often cause people to experience their day-to-day life more intensely. One of the current threads that I've become aware of recently anyway is how this word overexcitability has come to be translated from the Polish. That's how it was originally translated, I believe, in the English translations of Dabrowski's work. The potential unfortunateness of that translation is that often when we have the word over at the beginning of something, we interpret that to mean too much. So overexcitability can sometimes be interpreted as being too excitable. So if people tend to refer to themselves as this way or think of themselves as this way, it can create a negative self-image. So a different way to think about this is to think about this as super stimulatability. Thank you, Marisol, for your comment. And so this may be um, one way that this manifests may be particularly in the sensual realm. So the sensual realm in this instance would be a super or a hyper acuity to anything that the physical senses would respond to. So some people are very, so we're going to go into each of these in detail. So Marisol, when we get to that slide, if you want me to go into more detail, let me know then. So for now, we'll just go ahead and move on. So the first of these is psychomotor overexcitability. Again, I won't spend a ton of time on these because you guys seem to be pretty familiar with them. But psychomotor overexcitability is basically having a very strong physical presence, just an abundance of physical energy. Sometimes it can be an intense drive, it can be a focus. When coupled with the intellectual overexcitability, it can manifest as someone who can focus on things, an intellectual work or something that intrigues them for very long periods of time. So you might not sleep as much, you might not need as much sleep, you might be able to sustain interest for longer times, or you may hop around from one interest to another, but you may be able to have very long days that are very packed with activity going from one thing to another. So as with all the overexcitabilities, and I'll continue to refer to them that way throughout the presentation simply because it's the way that most people are familiar with, but do bear in mind that what we're talking about here is not anything that is necessarily negative. As noted here on the slide, sometimes when psychomotor overexcitability is not appropriately channeled or doesn't have a clear direction, people can be judged as misbehaving or acting out. But it can be an intense drive, which if taken to an extreme could be workaholism, but it could also be an intense commitment to one's work, the ability to actually make a very big difference in a certain area of focus. So for each of these overexcitabilities, there may be a possibility for it to manifest as a positive trait or as a negative trait. So we're not going to talk a lot today about diagnosis and how to differentiate between those, but basically one thing to think about, like RCS, this question, is there a way to differentiate between ADD, ADHD, and psychomotor OE? There is. The diagnostic criteria for these go into a good deal of detail, so I'm not going to go into that. But I think a very relevant question here would be, is this posing a problem for you or for the child that you may be thinking of? If it is, then regardless of whether or not it qualifies for a diagnosis, then some sort of intervention may be appropriate. And so what that intervention would be would depend on whether or not the diagnosis is appropriate. I often tend to encourage people to avoid medication when possible, especially with children, because there has not been a lot of testing about that sort of thing. But certainly when medication is necessary, such as for ADD or depression or bipolar, it shouldn't be avoided. So I hope that begins at least to address your question, RC. In terms of intellectual overexcitability, that can often manifest as an intense curiosity, being very focused and unquenchable thirst for knowledge sometimes. Sometimes this can be very fatiguing for one's companions. But on the positive side, it can create a great richness for the person that is driven by this, and for people with whom that person shares this interest or even shares this tendency. It's not unusual for people who have an intellectual overexcitability to be easily fascinated or interested in fields that are outside or topics that are outside of their own realm of interest, just because they can understand the level of intensity with which someone else may pursue it. So we'll talk a little later about interest level peers or interest peers, and that's where this may come into play. One of the other interesting manifestations of intellectual overexcitability can be a deep concern for this morality, for the fairness of all things. Emotional overexcitability may manifest as well, many of you may have seen this, so I don't know how much I need to explain it, but it can manifest as a very intense experiencing of emotions that may appear extreme to others. It can manifest as ethical concerns, as compassion for others, extreme idealism, social justice, all those sorts of things. And this is another area that is ripe for misdiagnosis, and that it can often be interpreted as bipolar, because sometimes the ways in which the emotions manifest may appear to swing widely or to manifest with an intensity that can be perceived as being pathological. But again, if the intensity of emotions is not problematic for you or for the person who's demonstrating them, then a diagnosis may not be relevant. Sensual overexcitability, which is what you were asking about earlier, is a high sensitivity to physical stimuli. So this might be textures, tastes, lights, odors, such that a person may experience some things as unpleasant or painful. As far as food goes, this may be understood as people being very choosy or finicky, when in fact, physiologically, it's a sensation that is simply intolerable or is simply too intense for the person to be able to process. It's not unusual for this to manifest in terms of tactile things, such as a certain allergy to certain fabrics or a high sensitivity to labels in clothing, for instance, among children. So those are ways in which this can manifest. I hope that clarifies that to some extent. So I talked a little bit about the ways in which it can be challenging, but it can also manifest in the ways that we as adults tend to think of sensuality. So it can lead to great enjoyment in the realms of music, language, art, sex, foods, different things that can bring great richness and pleasure and joy to our lives. So as with all the overexcitabilities, it can be definitely a factor that brings richness to one's life if we can find a way to cope with it, or to find a way to have it not overwhelm us. Imaginational overexcitability, my favorite example is Robin Williams, because he is just sort of off the charts whenever you tend to see him perform. That's kind of one of the more dramatic presentations. But basically this manifests as a rich imagery, fantasy play, a lot of animistic thinking, animals coming to life, a lot of metaphor. The risk here, again, for misdiagnosis or challenge is that sometimes adults who aren't perceiving this for what it is may think that the child is confused and can't determine reality, so it may be diagnosed as some sort of psychotic episode. It may also lead to a tendency to daydream, which can be problematic for a person. By the way, since you guys are familiar with some of these concepts, as I go through the presentation, if you would like for me to pick up the pace or slow down, please feel free to indicate that in the chat box. I'll do my best to oblige. So that's all the intro I'm going to give to the overexcitabilities. What I'd like to talk about next is the asynchronous brain development, and this along with the overexcitabilities. Um, Most study has been, let me think a minute about how to phrase this. The overexcitabilities arise from Dabrowski's work, and he tended to present them as something that all humans are capable of feeling and experiencing. And he tended to correlate the potential for overexcitabilities with IQ, but not uniquely in such way. So what I mean by that is that the overexcitabilities, anyone can manifest them. Um, it is simply more likely that they will manifest in the gifted population, and you will certainly see them manifest more often, more frequently, possibly more intensely in the gifted population. Now, one thing I didn't mention earlier is that since giftedness is often seen as an aspect of intelligence, that means that intelligence is being tested somehow. So often people do not perform well on tests, or they may get test pressure, or if they come from a different ethnic background, they may not score as highly as other people because a lot of the tests have built-in biases for white males. So, because that's who they were designed by. So it's quite possible that someone is gifted but not showing up as such, which is also something to consider. Um, Asynchronous brain development does happen across the population, but it definitely, I think, is more unique among the gifted population. And what it means is that basically different physical areas of the brain are developing physiologically at different rates. So some part of the brain will leap ahead. A child or a young person may show a prodigious abilities in mathematics or music or language or something like that, but they may be horrible at geography or something that requires memorization because it bores them. Um, or they may be quite intellectually engaged and perform well, but have very few or low level social skills. So that would kind of manifest as the stereotypic nerd. So one of the ways to think about that is that there is a physiological basis for that. It's not something that cannot be overcome, but it's definitely something that comes along with part of the gifted population. And the more gifted a person is, or the higher someone's IQ tends to be, the more this asynchronicity tends to manifest, the higher the degree. This can be confusing to people because often as someone is very smart in one area, we expect them to be very advanced in others. And that may not be at all the case. So it's important, again, not to judge that or not to say a person isn't trying. They may simply not have an aptitude for different things. It can also be very confusing because a child can speak in a very adult manner. Their language and verbal skills may be extremely articulate, and their vocabulary may be years, but even perhaps decades above their chronological age. However, that doesn't mean their emotional maturity is at the same level. So it can be very confusing sometimes in thinking, oh, well, I'm talking to a little adult here, when actually we're not. And so it's important to bear that in mind, that often when a child asks the questions, they may not understand all of the implications of it, or they may be emotionally processing it at a very different way, at a very different level than they sound like they're presenting it at. So this brings into question, I think, or it calls into focus the difference between intellect and judgment. Someone can be very smart, which would be their intellect, but their judgment would not necessarily be the best because that depends on a certain maturity, emotional development as well. With the asynchronous development, there's often some leveling that occurs as a person ages. However, sometimes that takes persistence, that takes a dedicated devoted effort to being aware of an area in which we may not perform as well, like social skills or language arts or something that doesn't interest us as much. And so we may have to put in more hours to become skilled at that if it's something that's more important to us. There are also some differences between how these things manifest between girls and boys. which means sometimes that it's more challenging to detect. It's often said, kind of along the level of social wisdom, that girls mature earlier than boys, and I certainly have witnessed that. I think that's often the case. I think what that translates to for the gifted population is that often gifted girls learn that high intellect can come at a cost, and that they may be ostracized or teased or judged if they're too smart, or if they're smarter than their peers. So it's very common for gifted girls to learn to dumb themselves down, because they value fitting in. They value having peers that appreciate them. So that's one way in which they differ. Sometimes gifted boys, their social skills may lag way behind the way girls would. So they might be held back not for their lack of intellectual abilities, but because they can't socialize in ways that are thought appropriate. So bearing all that in mind, we come to, the past. What's there to heal? And when I do this presentation for middle schoolers or kids, I often throw in this no big deal, because in my experience, this is often how kids or teens sort of approach a retrospective thought about their life. Oh, it's no big deal. I dealt with that. I got through it. And that is certainly true for many people, and people should be saluted for their successes in that regard. However, I think the second quote on this page is something that that the gifted population often has to deal with. Everyone admires and reveres Einstein, but nobody likes a know-it-all. So that's kind of the schizophrenic attitude, social attitude, that gifted children and adults are often exposed to. In the abstract, intelligence and performance are revered, but in terms of who you want to hang out with or who people want to be their friends, it can sometimes put people off. It may make other people feel, it may generate a feeling of inadequacy in other people, or confusion or competition. And so it can make fitting in a bit awkward at times. So the impacts of asynchrony, as we've been talking about, is that the brain is more developed in some ways than in others. So sometimes when we're, for school-age kids, they may be bored in the classroom, and that can easily be misinterpreted as trying to create trouble, people being a troublemaker. They may be not engaged, so their schoolwork may suffer, even though they're perfectly capable of following the material and keeping up. When these things manifest in the classroom or in the home situation in ways that are misinterpreted, the child will often hear that as they did something wrong, they're bad. Even if they don't get that feedback, they may get a very clear sense of being different. And I don't know how many of you as adults experience this as children. For most kids, being different is internalized as being bad. There's something wrong with me. Why don't I fit in? So it can easily generate a sense of inadequacy, a sense of being out of place, a sense of not having a tribe, of not belonging, of not fitting in, a sense of inferiority or confusion. Marcia Linehan has a great, a way I like of talking about this. This is a psychologist who lives up in Seattle, Washington. She's a contemporary. She's currently alive. And she talks about the brain in terms of different functions. She talks about rational mind and emotional mind. And in doing this, she's calling upon some wisdom traditions, as I alluded to earlier, which can often benefit psychology. So Marcia says that the rational mind is that part of us which processes thoughts, the intellect, what is perceived as intelligence. The emotional mind is the ability to identify and verbalize, understand our emotions, social interactions, to have empathy for others, to understand things from another's point of view. And she says it is only in the intersection of these that we find wisdom. This is where wise mind occurs. So I have another slide, but I see that my animations are not showing up. So it's probably, oh, it does show up okay for now anyway. So as kids, this is how it will appear. You'll see prodigious development in the cerebellum first, the rational mind. So this is the part about little adults. Kids may be perceived to be, oh, you're so adult and you're so mature. And those are different. They may indeed be very adult, they may be very intelligent, but they may not be mature because they may not have that emotional mind. Physiologically, it is likely to be lagging behind because of this asynchronous brain development. So that means the potential for wise mind is very, very small at this age. So again, this can be confusing to the child and to the adult. It can lead people to treat them as adults and they don't know how to behave as adults. So it has the potential to be quite confusing for a child as well as for other people. With age, you will often see some leveling so that it manifests as we saw on the previous side, or it grows to be that way. Sometimes, however, that takes a very persistent and explicit effort for that to occur. So what does that mean? It means that giftedness may feel that certain things come much more easily than for their same age peers. They might they might not have to study at all. They might do well in school or make good grades without really having to do things to work very hard for it. For areas that are of interest to them, they may really enjoy it, thrive on it. But for areas that are not of a person's interest, they may have zero interest. And this is again where that asynchrony may manifest, which can be confusing. A lot of times parents will ask, he does so well in math, why is he lagging so far behind in language skills or in art or in something else that they may think is important? And again, that could be that asynchronous development. It can also be just this characteristic of giftedness that for areas that are not of interest, it just doesn't, there's no hook for us. We don't see the point, kind of. So this can often manifest as having different interests from their same age peers, which can result in being more comfortable with older or younger youth and with adults. And when I say older or younger youth, sometimes it manifests in ways that younger kids will hang out with older kids who have similar intellectual interests, but they may hang out with younger kids socially because they may have a younger sense of humor or a younger understanding of social interaction. So younger kids may have lesser expectations of them, of how to behave socially. All of which can add up to simply feeling different, feeling like you're on the outside. This is exacerbated when anyone's overexcitabilities are taken out of context. They can easily be misunderstood. We just touched on this lightly earlier, but there's lots of presentations that Sing does where the overexcitabilities are diagnosed as a problem, where they're pathologized or seen as problematics. Seen as problematic. And that happens most often when the child's coping mechanisms present a problem for others. So if they're blurting out answers, if they're jiggling their feet in class as a way of releasing some of that psychomotor overexcitability, or if they're extremely clear about what they know because of their intellectual overexcitability, and they challenge the teacher, that can appear as not being respectful or as being a power struggle. So it's very easy for those overexcitabilities to be taken out of context. It's my experience that often when teachers can understand that this is what's going on, compensations can be made for that in the classroom. And certainly the child can be trained out of that behavior as long as it's done in a compassionate and non-judgmental way. Idealism is another factor that can come in to leave a child feeling other than. They can easily see how things ought to be. So discrepancies between that vision and the way things manifest in the real world can be perceived as hypocrisy. That can be painful, disappointing to them. It can lead to cynicism and depression. So all of this leads to something that I like to think of as buttons. You're probably all familiar, or many of you are familiar with the term, oh, it just pushed my buttons. What does that mean? What's this button that's getting pushed? Well, a button, as I think about it, is basically something that we have internalized, probably a past experience, some way in which we felt wronged, unheard, judged, or we internalized a negative sense of who we were. So it can create a sensitivity to similar situations that remind us of that. We may sometimes overreact, assuming that what a person means is similar to how a person judged us before. So all these experiences in childhood in which a child may have felt like they didn't fit in or they were different from their peers may lead them to either isolate, that's certainly one coping mechanism, or it can lead them to have a tendency to have this kind of a button, maybe having a chip on their shoulder, something like that. Physiologically, this is a neural pathway that is being developed. It's a habit that is being learned. And it's very similar to trauma. Trauma can be a single painful incident, like a rape or a car crash or being in a war type experience or a violent gang type experience. But it can also be a persistent pattern of neglect or abuse or a persistent pattern in which a person feels judged or wronged or othered. Um, so healing the past is basically about addressing this, learning one's buttons, helping our children to learn the areas to which they're sensitive or perhaps hypersensitive, and helping them to make more conscious choices, helping them to release that judgment, be more in control. And this is definitely, in my experience, a lifelong pursuit. So going from that past to the present, depending on where people are or where the children in your lives are, there may be unique opportunities in your present, and it's important to seek those out. So for children, it may be finding staff that can understand and can relate to what your child may be going through. There might be teachers, counselors, parents, mentors. You yourself, those of you who yourselves are parents, may be part of these unique opportunities. By learning to understand your own giftedness or your child's giftedness, you can become one of these people who helps them to find unique opportunities, to value their attributes, to learn to use their overexcitabilities as strengths, to have patience for their asynchrony, to help them develop skills in areas that are more challenging for them. Often this may be a road or a life path of integrating one's intellect and gifts into one's identities. And for many people, a big part of this is learning how to learn. When things come easily for gifted people, the learning process is near instantaneous. It's like people have often said it's like a sponge. You just absorb things. There's not a studying process. There's not a reiterative process that's necessary. So the advantage of that is that for things that they're interested in, very easy to build up a base of knowledge and expertise. However, a person like that may never learn how to actually learn. They may not learn how to study, how to embed information in their brain that does not get absorbed in this sponge-like way. So that may be an opportunity that teachers and counselors have to coach, encourage, help a child to develop patience for that process. One of the things that's most common and important about the present is establishing good peer relationships. And this is one of the concerns that I hear perhaps most commonly, how to help their children. So the importance of this is in combating this sense of loneliness or this sense of being terminally unique. So having a sense of belonging, having a sense of peers that are like one's self can be very, very important. This is where that early peer rejection can lead to emotional challenges later. So it leads to the importance of what I would call same interest peers. As opposed to age level peers. So that might mean encouraging your child to engage with other children that are in a gifted and talented program, or it might mean syncing out your local Mensa chapter if they have a children's branch. So finding kids that are on their intellectual peer, or it might mean helping them to meet kids that are older than they are. But who can have a similar level of intellectual capacity. And on the other hand, it may mean helping find kids who are younger than them who have compatible emotional development. So finding that sort of mixture of peers which matches your children is extremely important, and I want to acknowledge up front that it can be very exhausting and difficult. However, I would like to encourage you by saying it truly is worth the effort, simply because studies have shown that having same interest peers or having some sense of belonging at as early an age as possible has lifelong benefits. It reduces the ramification of these negative internal associations in a huge degree. One of the things that's often a challenge here also is what I call the conformity lure, which is sometimes what I was talking about earlier in the way girls that will sometimes adapt differently, that lure of fitting in, of conforming, and that can lead to underperforming and the use of alcohol and other drugs when you may not want your children to be going that way. So Deborah, I see you've asked a question about how to learn in more detail. we don't have time to go into that right now, but I'll try to come back to that at the end if we do. Ways to encourage children to do that can be quite challenging. Sometimes it's a matter of enticing, setting up a reward system. Uh, Sometimes it's a matter of trying to build on their strengths. So, for instance, if they have an intellectual overexcitability, or if they have a very high, if you've seen them demonstrate a high level of curiosity of things, finding a way to make them curious or encourage their curiosity about a different topic can be a great way to do it. It's sort of like dropping breadcrumbs along the path. So it will require creativity on your part. It will require kind of thinking outside the box on your part. How can I get my child interested in this? Sometimes, if it's something like physical exercise or sports, it may be a matter of doing things with them or of requiring them to do things in order to, get an allowance or in order to earn privileges or things like that, and simply explaining this is something we need to learn to do. I know you don't like it. We all have to do things in life we don't like. This is your challenge for now. So there may be some level of just sort of helping them to learn that life does involve, at all ages, doing things we don't enjoy doing. And that in itself can be a hugely valuable skill later in life when they get into the workplace, when it will almost inevitably hit someone. Um, so where can you find these peer group opportunities? It definitely takes seeking them out. As I mentioned earlier, a school gate program, Mensa programs, often people forget to think about their relatives. But if you live in an area where your relatives live nearby, if your child is gifted, his cousins, brothers and sisters, even if they're at different ages, may not be as intellectually gifted as he is, but they may not be far behind. So even trying to encourage relationships with relatives, or sometimes even distant relatives, that level of intellect may manifest sort of in those branching family trees, is definitely worth it. Mentioning Mensa and honor societies, some people see this as people just getting together to pat themselves on the back, or sort of touting their intellect, or wanting to brag about themselves, and that can be the case. I'm a member of Mensa. I'm a member of Triple Nine Society, which has a higher bar at which to join it. You have to score higher on tests in order to join it. So I've certainly seen my share of that, where people have a certain level of entitlement or a certain level of wanting to show off their intellect in those organizations. But I've also seen them as a place where being smart is okay and being different is okay, because almost everyone that I've met in those organizations has had a sense of being perceived as being slightly quirky. In one way or another. And so simply being able to be with other people where this quirkiness is okay can make a huge difference. So it can lead to that feeling of being not so different or not as alone. Sometimes this means taking social challenges yourself. So for instance, if you're an adult and you're one of the ones who in the polls at the beginning said, no, I'm not a gifted adult, or said, I'm not sure if I'm a gifted adult, maybe this means coming to terms with some level as to how this has played out for yourself. Now, giftedness is often defined as, again, kind of the top 2 to 3.5% of the population. But the traits that we're talking about manifest to different degrees well into the top 10%, sometimes even the 15 or 20th percentile. So even if you say, oh, well, I'm not gifted, that doesn't apply to me. Well, it may be true that if you don't score very high on IQ tests, or if you're not a good test taker, you may not be able to qualify for Mensa or things like that. Nonetheless, you may have been subjected to very similar things in your life. So it may cause you, helping your child or your students to do this, may force you to kind of address those issues in yourself as well. I shouldn't say may force you. If you rise to the challenge and deal with your own demons, it may enable you to be more helpful for your children. That may be a better way to put it. So some things that gifted kids do, which often extend into the adult workspace, is deny exceptionalness. And this is where I was talking about earlier, where some people say, oh yeah, well, I used to be gifted. Or yeah, well, I was a gifted child. And what happened then? I mean, the only way that a gifted child would not be a gifted adult would be perhaps brain damage. Because this is, again, a part of intrinsically who we are. there's often, because of the asynchrony, a sense of, oh, well, I'm not really gifted because I'm not as smart as so and so, or I'm not really gifted because I'm only good in math. So it's very easy, or I'm not really gifted because I'm not world famous. So it's really fascinating to me and very, very common for people to not perceive themselves as gifted because of that. There's often, I think, also a disincentive to be gifted, partly because of social attitudes, but also partly because it can be too much. A lot of times, again, the emotional overexcitability, sometimes the intellectual overexcitability, the sensual overexcitability, the imaginational overexcitability. All of those can be seen as you're too much, you're too intense, please tone it down. And I've certainly heard that and know other adults who have heard that even in the workplace as adults. So they may end up in the place where they're wrestling with themselves, really wanting to be themselves fully, and yet constantly getting environmental and social reminders that this presents challenges for other people. So it may become important to learn to uh, let that be other people's problems, so that you can tease back or so that people cannot internalize that. So again, trying to develop a non-judgmental inventory of one's skills and attributes, as well as identifying ways in which one might like to be better or one's life could be improved, can be a great place to start. I think that is a more adult activity, but I think adults can do that on behalf of their children and students as they see the students develop. So we're coming back a little bit to the question that came up earlier about how to learn in more detail, and this is partly for me about developing habits and skills. Gifted adults often underachieve, partly because often they don't have to work very hard to excel at their area of choice or to be good enough to do a job well, to get raises, to get promotions. They may, again, mask their intelligence in order to be socially accepted, but that may lead to a certain level of self-judgment, a poor self-image in some way that will be self-defeating later on. In the past, again, that can come out because of limited or non-existent intellectual peer groups or interest level peers. Sometimes one of the challenges that gets presented to kids is they say, oh, they hear, sorry, people say to them, you are so smart, you could do anything you want. And frankly, for a child, that is not helpful at all because they really do not understand where to go with that. Well, that's great, but how do I know what I want to do? How do I distinguish between things I do well and things that I like to do? How do I figure out what my desires and talents are? And more than that, how do I develop the habits and the skills that it will take in order to turn my dreams into realities? And this is partly about, again, learning to learn, learning how to learn, but it's also learning about how to take information or intellectual data and turn it into skills, because skills is what's really going to get the bang for the buck in the workplace as adults. This is what we get rewarded for. Is for how we perform. So trying to identify what those are, and again, encouraging people, acknowledging, this is sort of like also what we were talking about earlier about how to encourage them to do things they're not interested in. An incentive system is often helpful, acknowledging that it's hard, sometimes sitting with them and doing it, even if it's boring for you, is helpful. So setting up some schedule of availability, letting them know this. I hear you when you say this is hard. I want you to try. I'm here. I want you to check in with me if you get stuck. So kind of be creating availability. If your time doesn't allow for that, then realizing sometimes gifted students still need tutors. So finding whatever help they may need in other ways, in other areas, can also be really important. So I hope this is all making sense. I haven't had questions come in a while. If there is anything that comes up, feel free to put it down there. We're doing okay time-wise. In terms of gifted adults, these are some of the studies that I was alluding to earlier, the studies that we have, which granted are not that many. indicate that they have better social adjustment if they have had a peer group or a past peer group that was their interest level peers, a place where they truly felt accepted. This becomes more and more challenging the brighter the child is, because it's more simply statistically, it's more and more challenging to find people by whom they feel mirrored, by whom they feel like, oh, you're like me. So sometimes finding peers in whom they feel partially mirrored or by whom they see a part of themselves is also very important. Um, Gifted adults and sometimes kids also, sometimes this can manifest in children, can show up as a level of perfectionism, a sensitivity and intensity, and again, sometimes this can be judged or misdiagnosed as as OCD, obsessive compulsive. It can come from simply understanding things deeply and complexly, in a complex way. But it can also create a sense of stress and pressure of never meeting one's own standards. This is kind of like that idealism, seeing the potential to perform at a certain level, but not yet reaching that level, can lead to that not good enough feeling. So for instance, if a child is perhaps a musical prodigy but compares himself to adults or professionals who are performing at the peak of their careers, they might say, oh, but I'm not that good. So they may have unreasonable expectations for their age and for their level of practice. So again, helping them to understand that they will get better with time or that they can get better with time can be important there. Again, helping them to learn patience. One of the things which can be a huge strength as an adult is this immense capacity to care, for compassion, to empathize with others. But if it is stymied, or if it's seen as ways in which our institutions do not live up to their potential, that can lead again to a certain jadedness. So those of you who are online when Stephen was doing that very gracious introduction of me know that my background is quite varied. I have a bachelor's degree in mathematics. I have a bachelor's degree in vocal performance. I have a master's degree in psychology. I work currently as a computer software support person, as a psychotherapist, and occasionally as a professional singer. I used to work more as a professional singer. I'm also a licensed minister, a licensed shiatsu person. So I think most people would think of me as along the multipotentiality level of this scale. This is a scale that is kind of in my theory of how I think often of gifted people, is that sometimes we manifest on this spectrum, where at one end there are people who are quite savant. They have amazing skills in a particular area. They're very focused. All of their interest is in this area. They may be socially underdeveloped. They may be autistic, but that is not necessarily always the case. Bill Jobs might be an example of this type person. Again, Robin Williams might be an example of this type person in a very different field. Extremely competent and just kind of off the scale. Multipotentiality is very different. You may have many different interests, and people may excel at many different areas, and yet because they do not choose to or are not interested in focusing their interests into one particular area, they may think of themselves again as not enough, or they may think, oh well, I'm not gifted because I don't fall into that savant category. So it's interesting to just sort of see where you might fall, where your children might fall along this. And again, discernment can be important, discerning in the sense of distinguishing one thing from another. But it's important to discern without judgment, without a good or bad evaluation of them. Certainly helpful and unhelpful, might be ways to talk about it. But that's very different and will be internalized very different. When kids or students particularly identify with this multi-potentialed end of this spectrum, it can lead to what I'm calling here as overchoice syndrome. a great deal of confusion and often anxiety about what do I do? How do I know what I want to do? Kids can get pressured into, well, what do you want to specialize in? What do you want to study in college? What do you want to be when you're an adult? And they may not know simply because they may have so many things that fascinate them, or even just two or three things that fascinate them equally, or where they're very drawn to in different ways. So often a helpful question to ask is, well, what do you think you might like to do first? Or what do you think you might like to do at this point in your life? Leaving the door open for the possibility of pursuing those other things later on. So those are some ways in which the present can help to deal with the impact of the past. So let's talk a little bit about the future. I often think of this as the present being the place where we can heal the past, acknowledge the buttons we may have, the ramifications that have come into our lives. It's also, in some ways, the fulcrum because it's also the launching pad from which we will be creating our futures. And no matter what our age or what point our children are, that's always true. The present is the point from where we will create the future. So it can be important to think about here, what do we want our future to look like? What's next on my horizon? What are my choices there? And that can lead to these questions about what subjects do I want to study? What jobs do I want to pursue? Acknowledging perhaps some real life limitations, where to go and what to do may depend somewhat on the cost, what's affordable, on the location, how far away is a child comfortable going, especially if a child has skipped certain grades, are they at an age where they can live alone or live in dormitories, or do they need to stay closer to home? So things like that will lead to questions not only about college, but about boarding school programs as adults, summer programs as kids, things like that. This big question about what do you want, I think can be very challenging, and for children especially, but also as adults, I think it can be very challenging to distinguish between what do you like to do versus what do you do well. Especially in the school system, we get a lot of reinforcement positively for what we do well, for how we perform. So often we will think, oh, well, that's what I'm going to do. People say I'm good at this, so that's what I'm going to do. What if we actually don't enjoy it that much? So trying to help a child figure out that process is very important, and there is no magic wand about this. But engaging them in conversations about, well, what do you like about doing those math problems? Or what do you like about what's it like for you when you read? I know you like to go and read for hours at a time, or you like to always have a book with you when we're walking in the woods. What do you like about that? And trying to basically force them to engage or encourage them strongly to engage. And again, this can go along the lines of loving, slightly strong-armed, perhaps parenting or teaching. You're saying, I know you don't want to talk about this. I get that. We need to talk about it. So bear with me. We're not going to talk about it forever, but I need you to spend a few minutes just trying to understand this or trying to explain it to me. And often acknowledging where the child may be coming from, even if it's not a place they want to go to, helps them to feel heard, helps them to feel engaged. Relationships is a great thing I think to talk about. They can be very confusing, especially if you're dealing with a person where this asynchronous development is manifesting in a way where their social expertise or their empathy for others is lagging behind. So figuring out what's important in a partner. How do I know that? Trying to figure out that this may change as we go along. How do they assess that? So learning that it's okay to ask questions about this, being available to talk about it if kids want to, reflecting on it for yourself. Is important. Having permission for things that appear mysterious can also be important. Like, well, nobody else likes this person, but I feel really comfortable with them. Is it okay to hang out with him or with her? And that may be, important to say, sure. If you want to, we can try to figure out what is comfortable with you, what's different about this person, why you feel like yourself around them. But, if they don't need to have that conversation, that may be fine as well. One thing that I do want to stress here is a lot of the way down the slide, just learning communication skills and empathy can be very important. So sometimes the way asynchrony can manifest is that kids may have a certain judgment or rejection of other people's way of seeing things. I mean, well, I know this, I learned this, this is the right way to do things, or this is the way we do it at home. I know that's the right way. They may have a certain black or white thinking. So letting them know, yes, that's absolutely true for you, or that's absolutely true for our family. Other people do things other ways, and that's okay. Learning to helping them to learn to open their mind to other ways of thinking, and that make sense to other people even if they don't understand it, can be a great way to build empathy. And the importance of that is the first sort of sub-bullet here about negotiating conflict. What research has shown is that for adults, the number one skill in maintaining long-term intimate relationships is conflict management. It's not shared interests, it's not shared background, it's not coming from a similar ethnic or religious background as another person, it's not having similar life values or similar goals. It's about how to negotiate the conflicts that will inevitably arise. And the ability to negotiate conflict often hinges on exactly this, empathy and the ability to communicate clearly. I'm just going to pause for a sec to have some water here, excuse me. Often it is important also to help kids be open about relationship structures. So, having play dates with kids that they may see once a month or rarely might be important. As adults, it might mean, or as your kids approach a dating age, it might mean, letting them think about things in a different way. What works for you? If you're not ready to date yet, that's okay. If you want to date, but the idea of holding hands or kissing grosses you out because there's all that sensual overexcitability that's just too hard to manage, that's fine. Helping people deal with peer pressure is really important around all this as well. Often this leads to conversations about, well, where am I going to go after college? How am I going to do work? A couple of things are challenging here. How to translate one's abilities into happiness can be a challenge. So that's where knowing yourselves is important, that kind of honest, non-judgmental inventory I was speaking about earlier, not only of one's skills, but about one's needs and desires as well. How to deal with others' expectations can also be important. And it's also important to note that it is built into our society that there are few opportunities for intellectual recognition outside of the college or academic environment. So this is what leads people sometimes to think, well, I'm not gifted anymore, or I used to be a gifted person, is that they just don't get the same type or level of recognition. The next few slides I have go into kind of the work world. So this is going kind of far into the future. So I'll go through these somewhat quickly. If you want me to slow down, just indicate that. But in terms of taking challenges and turning them into opportunities, it's just important again here to make space to be non-conforming. Because often, especially for giftedness, how one does not fit in can become a key to learning how to make the most of your skills and of your likes and dislikes. Finding ways to deal with boredom is equally important because, again, in the workplace, there will often be perhaps bosses or colleagues who are not keeping up with one. So it's important to figure out ways to tolerate that, to adapt, to create the variety that you might need in your workplace. Or again, if you're working with a child or a teenager who's starting to work, helping them to be creative about how to use this. Thinking about trying to identify and think about their OEs and how to turn what might be seen as potential liabilities into assets. So seeing a psychomotor OE as a high access to high levels of energy that may allow them to be very diverse or to participate in sports or to have a really focused corporate climbing career. If they have very high intellectual OE, how to engage that in an academic way or develop their expertise highly. Emotional OEs can lead to great deal or a great ability to empathize, which can be highly useful in the arts, the performing arts, in the healing arts, in fields of social justice. Sensual OE can actually be very helpful in the way of differentiating between different things, different tastes, different textures, different sensations. That can be very useful in things like the culinary field or in honing one's empathy about how someone else may experience something, or even in physical traits like massage that may come in handy and may be important to a person, realizing they may have physical needs that need to be met that they could meet professionally if they choose to do so. So those are just a few examples that I'm throwing out. Um, these are the five main work-life strategies that tend to manifest for gifted adults. So it may be worth thinking about how do these start to manifest in kids. Gifted adults tend to either become inconspicuous, keeping a low profile, trying to not shine too much, or they may really want to be accepted socially, which may mean either seeking out a place where their giftedness is okay, finding people, so working at places like Google or things like that may be important. Developing a social strategy is very important to some people because they realize that this intellectual level of acceptance is not enough. They want certain levels of heart connection and that that can manifest across intellectual ranges. Sometimes people will develop a confrontational style. So, well, what do you mean I'm too smart? What do you mean I'm too intense? Kind of having that chip on the shoulder that I was talking about earlier. Sometimes this isolation occurs, which may look a little like inconspicuousness. So earlier, one of you was asking about how do you push or challenge someone to learn or to be different than they are. I think another great thing to think about, and which I've often been asked, is when do you know you should challenge or push someone? And I think these strategies may be a useful framework in which to think about that. If you see that a child is developing an isolating technique or a confrontational technique or an inconspicuous technique, ways that they are their self-concept may causing them to feel like they don't fit in or have to be different or are different. If you see those starting to manifest at a young age, kind of in school patterns or in social patterns, that might be the time to try to intervene and to think about and talk about different strategies. So sometimes ways to do that are ways to identify the way a gifted person sees something, the way versus other people may see it. So this is just a chart about how that may manifest in work. A gifted employee may say, I have a great sense of justice. We need to do the right thing. And their management say, but that's not what we're here to do. A gifted employee may say, well, I'm held back all the time. This is so slow. I need to be going faster. Whereas that may be seen as not being cooperative in the workplace or having bad timekeeping in meetings. So again, kind of looking at some of how the gifted child may frame some of these things or how their behavior may demonstrate this and helping them to understand how other people may perceive that can be helpful as long as it's done from a non-judgmental perspective and with a problem-solving approach. Well, how do you think we could manage that? How do you think we could help people to understand you? And how do we think we can help you to fit in better? These are just kind of skills that go along with giftedness that may manifest in the workplace that again can start to demonstrate themselves at an early age. And again, this is why thinking about the future may be helpful in the present in terms of looking back at the past, seeing how these things have manifested, how they're manifesting in the present, what opportunities they might present in the future. It's from that framework that I'm talking about these skills in the workplace. So the ability to simultaneously consider various options or possibilities, to abstract, to think of things abstractly, in other words, to verbalize things with high levels of imagery, to really enjoy looking at things from multiple different facets. All of these things can be very important. So seeing the potential for them in your children or your students can be great, and helping them to encourage their development can yield very big long-term benefits. Sometimes demands the ability to have self-confidence and possibly self-marketing. So again, that can start at an early age simply in terms of helping a child to understand to be able to be proud of oneself, of their accomplishments. Um, and even if they don't fit in, if people are judging them for being different, just pointing out that a lot of people are misunderstood early in life because they, or may perhaps people don't value or don't understand the value of what they're offering, but that may catch up with them. And certainly some of their um, interest level peers may appreciate them in those ways. So we're at the end or approaching the end of our time as well as our content. Just a brief summary here, some of the characteristics of the gifted population are the speed of thought, being able to rapidly associate things or process things, assimilate things quickly, being highly sensitive intellectually, and that extending to the entire nervous system. We didn't really talk about this, but the majority of the population at large is extroverted at a ratio of like 60 or 70 extroverts to 30 to 40% introverts. The highly intelligent population is exactly the reverse. So you'll see 60 to 70% introverted, extroverts are far fewer. And the higher you go on the intellectual scale in terms of how people show up on IQ points, the higher the degree of introversion that tends to manifest. Again, this is not always the case. This is just what tends to show up, in groups, or if you look at this as a population. So what that means is that people can feel easily hurt, easily misunderstood. They may not understand exactly how to fit in. Um, the rest of these we've talked about also perfectionism, learning what one's learning style is, and there's also a possibility for heightened depression and anxiety because of this sense of not fitting in. So simply being aware of that and keeping an eye out for it, how to help children learn to deal with that or dealing with it for yourself as adults can also be very important. So again, this is just some of the things we've been talking about, this heightened empathy, how to deal with that, how to learn to fit in, when to choose to fit in, how to deal with this sense of loneliness and finding a peer group, and learning to accept oneself, having that sense of authenticity and self-actualization as a lifelong quest can be a hugely enjoyable life path. So those are the basic topics that I'd hoped to share with you today. I hope some of these have been helpful for you. Obviously, I have an unabashed plug for self-exploration. I think self-knowledge is a huge benefit for us. The past will influence us, but it doesn't have to determine our future. And the extent to which it doesn't have to determine our future can mean healing these emotional wounds, finding help when needed, and growing beyond any restrictions that we may be imposing on ourselves. We can certainly influence our children by kind of walking the walk, having self-respect, and um, a mix of pride and humility about our own intellectual skills and achievements. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. We certainly have time left for some questions in addition to the ones we've taken all along. I think the only one that's outstanding is the one that just came in, where Marisol, you asked about what do you mean about predicting trends? And I guess this is what I mean by that is if you look at some of the slides that I had here about adult behavior, thinking about what that might look like from a child perspective, or how that might manifest in a school environment. So like for instance, earlier I talked about life strategies, one of which was isolating, one of which was confrontational. So in terms of predicting trends, looking at ways, seeing how that might manifest in a child. Does your child tend to go off on their own a lot, more than to the point where you might be concerned about it? Do they seem to have a chip on their shoulder, or are they easily, is their button easily pushed, or they're easily lured into acting out? So those might be ways to predict trends in terms of life strategies or coping skills. So I hope that makes some sense there to you. So if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to pop them up there. Um, I'll just kind of keep talking and addressing the comments that are coming in through chat. But Steve, if you have anything,
I am here. I'm
great.
letting you go ahead. Did you see that
Okay.
last question from Marisol?
I did, yeah. So it's a great question, and this often comes up about adults, about, how do I help my children understand this? I'll just make the question a little more global. As kids approach adult age, so anywhere from late adolescence onward, I think that's when people start to develop a sense of introspection and a sense of being able to make more choices. In terms of Erik Erikson, who has a great theory about stages of development, he says that in the adolescent period, or in late adolescence, is when we as individuals start to take responsibility for ourselves. So, up until that point, our lives are often controlled by our parents or our teachers. We have to do what we're told. But starting in adolescence, we get to start to take charge of our own life, make our own choices, test the waters, learn to make choices and live with consequences in the real world. And a part of that, I think, is exactly this question of how do we anticipate or no, how do we help children, sorry, not anticipate, but integrate their own giftedness as a part of their identity? So if this presentation has been helpful for you, or if you think it would be helpful for your children, your older children, or students, I would say definitely share it with them, or if there are other presentations. But what I would also encourage is to either watch it with them or to watch it separately and set a time to discuss it later. Because again, this can often go in the area, well, you're smart, you can figure it out. I'll give you this, and that's enough. And that's sort of like a parent giving a child a book about sex and saying, well, did you understand all of it? They may get the information, but it will not help them to learn how to talk about it. And that's a key part of what they need here is to know that it's okay to talk about these things. It's okay to wrestle with them or struggle with things like this. Um, and certainly your family may have children that are identified as gifted versus children that are not identified as gifted. And they may share, again, some of, I'm sorry, I'm stumbling a little bit here. Even the non-gifted students or children you have may see themselves in some of these slides. So certainly if you want to share it with other people in the sense that it may help them understand themselves, they may see the same trends to a different degree, or it may simply help to build familial understanding. I think that can be important. The risk here is that words and labels have an impact. So if you have a family in which some children start to say, well, I'm gifted, and other children say, well, I guess I'm not gifted because I didn't get into that program, or I didn't get that label, or I didn't score that way, that can lead to a sense of sibling rivalry, competition, distance between siblings. So helping them to understand this as an aspect of who we are and maybe a different way to think about oneself is very important, but it doesn't convey a sense of better or worse or good or bad or any of that. Throughout the presentation today, I've talked a little bit about emotional needs, misdiagnoses, or even accurate diagnoses where the OEs can manifest in ways that are challenging. So some ways that can happen is that often the gifted population has a higher tendency, well, I mean, statistically, it does have a higher tendency towards both anxiety and depression, as well as some other things. So sometimes the question comes up is what should we look for in trying to find a counselor for our child? So I would say two things, or maybe more, about that, but two immediately come to mind. One is that the number one factor for successful outcomes in therapy, both for adults and children, is a feeling of rapport. So having your child be involved in the process and finding someone that they feel with whom they feel comfortable talking, where they feel heard, accepted, um, liked, where they feel comfortable talking or playing or expressing themselves is of huge import. A lot of parents that I've dealt with have found that it's really important to find a counselor or therapist who either has training in working with the gifted population or is willing to learn about it. Other parents have said it's not as big a requirement. Um, so that I think is kind of a case by case basis. I would say more often than not, the parents find it helpful to have a counselor or therapist who has some level of background in this area because it can help so much to normalize what a child is experiencing. So again, they don't get judged by it or don't judge themselves for it. It takes one of the studies that I've seen is that it takes a ratio of 4 to 1 of positive comments to negative comments in order to actually internalize that. So, in other words, if a child gets one sort of jeering comment, oh, there goes the know it all at school, it takes 4 equally authentic positive comments about, oh, it's so great that you remembered that. Oh, it's wonderful that you're so smart. It takes 4 of those positive comments simply to balance the one negative one. So again, this repetition of positive reinforcement is hugely important. And finding that in a counselor and having a counselor who understands that and is willing to normalize that repeatedly and patiently and with compassion, I think is a huge part of what's important for finding good fits for your kids. So I have tried to address all the questions that have come up, except for the one that just popped up, which is quite long. So give me
Wow.
a sec to digest that. Um,
So on that note, what exactly can we do about this? I still feel lost as an adult parent trying to help my children not fall into the same trap to help deal with. For example, how to be true to yourself. My daughter is coming off as a know-it-all. Keep self-esteem, but get along with others? Probably a loaded question. My daughter and I both have trouble articulating our feelings we have to process. You mentioned it earlier, but not sure why we have this difficulty when we're gifted. Being both logical thinker,
mm,
that doesn't make sense to me.
mhm,
How do we help a strong-willed, gifted 12-year-old daughter to deal with this social know-it-all
mhm.
without taking her spirit or self-esteem?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I want to do is just acknowledge the challenge because this is not easy. And again, I think this ties into the whole idea that being gifted or being smart doesn't that mean that things should come easily to me? Doesn't that mean that all things should come easily to me? And I would challenge you a bit by saying, what would lead you to think it should be? If you are smart, and if you, let's say, for instance, that you might be quite gifted in literature or in mathematics, well, does that then mean that you should uh, also be a world-class performing musician? I think most people would say, well, no, why would I expect that? That's a completely different aptitude. And I would say that learning about one's emotions is exactly the same thing. It's this thing for which some people have more of an aptitude than others. Also, because of the asynchrony, it may be an area which has never been encouraged to develop, or it may be an area that was slow to develop, and a person never understood the need or had the encouragement to persistently, patiently explore it and try to develop that as a skill. So, making small talk, for instance, or learning to put people at their ease, having what are truly social skills and are sometimes seen as extrovert skills. Those things often do not come naturally to a very bright person, partly because they may be highly introverted, but partly because they may be highly intellectual and their emotions may not be as big a part of their identity. So I just want to say first, there may be lots of reasons why it's not easy to do this. At the same time, it may be important to think about what is important to your daughter about being a know-it-all. And this is, I'm saying your daughter just because that's how the question came up, but I think it's true for adults as well as kids. What's important about being perceived as an expert? Maybe this is where their sense of identity is being based. So it may be important to encourage the sense of acknowledging how smart one is in a particular area. It may also be important to understand the importance of allowing people to ask for information as opposed to offering it. It sort of goes along with that idea of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. Putting out information simply because you know it is sort of like trying to force them to drink. It's putting out information that people may not be ready for, may not be interested in, or may not be able to take in at the pace that you're getting along with. So finding a way to articulate that as this is a great skill you have, let's figure out ways in which you um, can do that in ways that are helpful to others. So even dropping a hint about if somebody says, oh, I was trying to figure out the math homework, no, 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 instead of saying, oh, it's easy, blah, 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 maybe saying, oh, yeah, I understand that was really hard. Luckily, finding a way to say, um, it's one of those things that actually comes easy for me. If there's some way I can help you, I'd be happy to. And acknowledging things that don't come easily to your daughter may be another way to kind of bond around that. So I hope that's an adequate answer for now. It could be a long question, but certainly finding a therapist with which you could work or with your family could work might be a way to proceed along that, or finding ways to have family discussions about it can also be helpful. So we're pretty much the end of our time. Steve, did you have any wrap-up comments today, or? Okay. Well, I just want to thank everyone for participating, for your encouragement. I certainly hope you took something from the presentation. Feel free to share it with others, and I certainly encourage you to attend the SENG conference in San Jose next summer. If you have found this of value, you will find many presentations similarly valuable at the conference.
Yes. Great, Cal. I really do appreciate your speaking to us this evening. Your talk was very interesting and gave us a lot of insight to what it's like, how gifted people need to deal with their giftedness and how to do this self-exploration. So I want to thank you
Thank
all
you.
for attending this evening. Cal, you did a great job. I want to thank you for speaking as well, and the presentation went off very well. So I want to say then a good evening to you all. I want to say thank you to you all and good evening. Thank you. Goodbye.